One of the most recognizable faces in film history is gone. But the reason his work still feels alive today has nothing to do with awards, box office numbers, or even fame. Robert Duvall didn't just play characters, he disappeared into them, quietly, patiently, and without asking for attention. At 95 years old, after a career that stretched across 7 decades, Duvall passed away peacefully at home, according to publicly shared statements from his family. But here's what makes his story different. Some of his most unforgettable performances weren't about being loud, heroic, or even likable. They were about truth, and that truth reshaped modern acting in ways many people never fully noticed. So how did a man who often stayed in the background end up defining some of cinema's most iconic moments? The answer starts earlier than you might expect. Long before Hollywood knew his name, Robert Duvall grew up in a world defined by structure, discipline, and long absences. He was born in San Diego in 1931 into a military family. His father served as a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy, which meant home life often revolved around duty and distance. In later interviews, Duvall would reflect on how that absence shaped him. Not with resentment, but with observation. As a child, he didn't stand out academically. By his own admission, school was a struggle. What came naturally wasn't math or memorization. It was watching people, listening, noticing how they spoke, paused, and reacted when they thought no one was paying attention. That instinct would become his greatest strength. After high school, Duvall joined the U.S. Army and served in Korea. According to publicly available accounts, he never saw combat. But the experience reinforced something important. He wasn't meant to follow a conventional path. When he returned home, his parents encouraged him to explore acting seriously. It was a surprising turn, especially given his father's expectations. But it was also the first moment Duvall chose instinct over tradition. And that decision changed everything. Duvall didn't chase stardom, he chased craft. After studying drama at Principia College, he moved to New York City and trained at the neighborhood playhouse under Sanford Meisner, one of the most influential acting teachers of the 20th century. Meisner taught something radical at the time. Don't perform, react. Duvall absorbed that philosophy completely. Among his classmates were future legends, Dustin Hoffman, Gene Hackman, James Cain. But even in that room full of talent, Duvall stood apart. Not because he was louder or more confident, but because he listened more closely than anyone else. He immersed himself in theater, particularly off-Broadway productions, where subtlety mattered more than spectacle. In 1965, he won an Obie Award for A View from the Bridge. A year later, he made his Broadway debut. But the real turning point didn't come on a big stage. It came through a quiet recommendation. Playwright Horton Foote noticed something rare in Duvall: restraint. Foote later wrote the screenplay for To Kill a Mockingbird and personally recommended Duvall for the role of Boo Radley. It would be Duvall's first film role. And in that performance, with barely any dialogue, his philosophy was already clear. Say less, mean more. Throughout the 1960s, Duvall appeared in a series of films that slowly built his reputation among directors and actors, even if the general public hadn't caught on yet. He showed up in Bullitt, in True Grit, in MASH. Each time he blended in. And that was the point. Duvall didn't want the audience to see him. He wanted them to see the character. That approach reached a new level in 1972 when he was cast as Tom Hagen in The Godfather. Hagen wasn't the loudest member of the Corleone family. He wasn't the most intimidating. And he wasn't even fully accepted as one of them, which is exactly why Duvall's performance worked. With calm precision, he portrayed a man constantly navigating loyalty and distance, someone always inside the room, yet never fully at home in it. The role earned him his first Academy Award nomination, but more importantly, it introduced a new kind of power on screen: quiet authority, and that power would follow him for the rest of his career. At this point, most actors would chase leading roles, bigger contracts, and more attention. Robert Duvall did something else. He waited, and that patience would lead to one of the most quoted scenes in film history, delivered in just a few takes. In 1979, Duvall appeared in Apocalypse Now, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. His role as Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore could have easily become exaggerated or theatrical. Instead, Duvall played him with unsettling calm. The performance was controlled, measured, almost casual, according to interviews given. Years later, some of the film's most iconic moments were captured in just one or two takes. Not because Duvall rushed, but because he arrived prepared. Coppola later explained that some actors take weeks to fully settle into a role. Duvall, he said, needed almost no time at all. He was already there. That performance earned him another Oscar nomination and further solidified his reputation as an actor other actors studied. But despite the recognition, Duvall wasn't satisfied. Not because he wanted more fame, but because he wanted more control. By the late 1970s, Robert Duvall had something most actors dream of: industry respect, critical acclaim, and a growing list of unforgettable performances. But privately, he felt stuck. Despite the awards and nominations, Duvall noticed a pattern. He was often being offered the same type of roles: powerful, memorable, but supporting. Characters that elevated films, yet rarely carried them. And instead of accepting that as his ceiling, he made a decision that surprised many people around him. He stepped away. At a time when momentum mattered most in Hollywood, Duvall returned to the stage. He starred in David Mamet's American Buffalo on Broadway, a raw, demanding play that required total commitment. It wasn't a career move designed for visibility. It was a statement. In interviews from that period, Duvall explained his thinking plainly. He wasn't interested in repeating himself. He didn't want comfort. He wanted growth, and that choice quietly reshaped how the industry viewed him. Most actors chase leading roles because they promise recognition. Robert Duvall questioned whether recognition was worth losing authenticity. That question would soon lead him to the role that defined his career, not through spectacle, but through restraint. In 1983, Duvall starred in Tender Mercies. The film itself was modest in scale. No grand effects, no dramatic monologues designed to impress. Instead, it focused on an aging country singer trying to rebuild his life quietly, away from the spotlight. It was exactly the kind of story Duvall believed in. His performance was understated to the point that some viewers barely noticed the technique behind it. And that was intentional. Every gesture mattered. Every pause carried weight. When Duvall won the Academy Award for Best Actor, he spoke less about achievement and more about freedom. According to interviews at the time, the award represented something deeper than validation. It gave him leverage, the ability to choose projects based on meaning rather than momentum. And from that point forward, he used that freedom carefully. After winning an Oscar, many actors pivot towards safer, more predictable success. Duvall went the opposite direction. He directed films. He wrote scripts. He took on challenging characters that didn't always fit traditional expectations of a leading man. In The Great Santini, the Apostle, and later The Judge, Duvall portrayed men filled with contradictions. Flawed, emotional, sometimes difficult to sympathize with. These weren't roles designed to make audiences comfortable. They were designed to feel real. In one interview, Duvall openly questioned the idea of movie star personas, suggesting that repeating the same version of yourself on screen would eventually become boring, both for the actor and the audience. That mindset kept his career unpredictable, and remarkably, it kept him relevant. Even in his later years, when most performers slow down or disappear, Duvall made another quiet choice. He kept working, not to prove anything, but because acting was never a phase for him. It was a way of life. Robert Duvall never formally retired. In his 80s and 90s, he continued appearing in films like Widows, The Pale Blue Eye, and Hustle. His roles became smaller, but his presence never faded. He also earned multiple Emmy nominations and wins for television work, proving once again that format didn't matter. Only truth did. When asked in later interviews what he enjoyed most about reaching his 90s, his answer wasn't about legacy or fame. It was about daily life, about spending time with his wife, about staying active, about continuing to work when it felt right. In his own words, he was always living well, and that philosophy defined him to the end. When news of Duvall's passing was shared publicly, tributes focused on his awards, his iconic lines, and his legendary collaborations. But those who studied his work closely noticed something else. Robert Duvall didn't just leave behind performances. He left behind a standard. What Robert Duvall actually left behind. When people look back at Robert Duvall's career, the first things mentioned are usually the obvious ones: the awards, the iconic films, the famous scenes. But those are results, not the legacy itself. Duvall's real contribution to cinema wasn't a single role or line of dialogue. It was a philosophy. He believed acting wasn't about being noticed. It was about being believed. That belief guided every decision he made, from choosing quieter roles to avoiding the pressure of becoming a fixed type on screen. He proved that a performance doesn't need volume to have impact, and that restraint can be just as powerful as intensity. For generations of actors who followed, that idea became a reference point. Not everyone adopted it, but everyone noticed it. There's a reason Duvall's performances still feel modern, even decades later, and it has less to do with style and more to do with honesty. Why his work still feels timeless. Trends in filmmaking change constantly. Acting styles shift, pacing evolves, audiences grow more demanding, yet Duvall's performances rarely feel dated. Why? Because he didn't act for the camera. He acted for the moment. His characters didn't announce who they were. They revealed themselves slowly, through behavior, silence, and contradiction. That approach ages well. When viewers return to his films today, they don't feel like they're watching a performance. They feel like they're observing a person who exists beyond the frame. And that illusion, that quiet realism, is incredibly difficult to achieve. Duvall made it look effortless. Another part of Duvall's legacy is something rarely discussed in Hollywood. He never reinvented himself to stay relevant. He didn't chase trends. He didn't adjust his persona to fit eras. He didn't brand himself. Instead, he refined the same principles over and over again. Listen, observe, respond truthfully. That consistency allowed him to move across decades, genres, and formats without losing credibility. Whether in large-scale productions or intimate character studies, the foundation remained the same. And because of that, his body of work feels cohesive, not fragmented. It tells one long story about human behavior. When someone like Robert Duvall passes away, it's natural to focus on what's been lost. But in this case, it may be more useful to focus on what remains. His films are still studied. His performances are still referenced, and his approach continues to influence actors who value truth over attention. That influence doesn't fade, it multiplies. Robert Duvall's career didn't end with a single defining moment. It ended the same way it began, quietly, with purpose, and without needing to explain itself. He showed that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stays consistent long enough to be undeniable. If you want to continue that conversation, the next chapter is already waiting.